Welcome to Sew Very Easy. My name is Laura, and today let's make some wine bags. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they need to have wine in them. There are lots of things we can put in these handy bags. The pattern for these wine bags is also a kit, and it's from June Taylor. And this set makes 3 of these wine bags. To make these, we need pre-printed quilt batting. So these are already printed for us because this is a quilt as you go. So we have all of these numbers. These numbers correspond with fabric measurements. And you quilt and flip, quilt, flip, quilt, flip. And by the time we're done all of the stitching, the entire bag is quilted and ready to be put together. In the directions, they have us use a spray adhesive, but I'm just going to use some school glue. Around the handle of the bag is a bias binding. Now we can make it ourselves, or we can buy it already made for us. All quilt batting has a tendency to stretch, and we really don't want this to stretch. So we're going to stick it onto our fabric, but we're going to need that fabric well pressed, because we're not going to press these layers together. We're going to glue these layers together. I want to glue this quilt batting onto the back of a fabric. So this is pressed, and this is just going to smooth out with our hands. You can use a spray adhesive, but since I do have the school glue, I'm going to be using that. I'm just going to place a series of dots all over the back of this fabric. And it's just dots. The quilting will keep it together. I just want this to stick onto my fabric without ironing anything. I've dotted the one side with glue, and I'm just going to smooth it down. And we do not want to stretch this. I have the one side. Now I'll do the second. And just some dots will work fine. Just smooth that down. And it will not take long for the glue dots to dry. I'm going to glue this bottom also onto some fabric. Just some glue dots and just press that down. No ironing required. By not ironing, it's going to make sure that this circle will match the bottom of the bag. If we stretch and pull one or the other, they're not going to match up as easily. So we don't need to press. We just need to let that glue dry. Once these are roughly cut out, we're going to do a row of stitching to hold the layers down and to give us a cutting line after. We need to stitch into the inside of this line only by about 2 or 3 threads. So it's really quite close to it. We're going to stitch around that outside line. We do not need to stitch these inside lines. For the circle, we're going to do the same thing. We need to stitch to the inside. So we're going to do that inside line. Then when we get to this cross mark, stitch in and then come back out. Continue going around, in, out, all the way around, so that when we're done, we're going to have those quarter marks stitched right into that bottom. You can see that stitching line is just inside. And I did stitch down on that mark. On the back I have my shape with my little registration marks. Place another piece of fabric on top of this. And from this side, just duplicate that stitch going all the way around. We will not need to do those registration marks. We just want to have these 3 layers together. With those 3 layers together, we're going to be able to trim right along that stitching line. Just follow the stitching line and stay on the outside of the circle. That bottom is now done. We can put this aside until we work on the bag. And the first piece is going to fit right inside those lines. We now will add on piece number 2. When stitched on, this edge will line up. And it does say this piece to be 2.5 inches by 6.5 inches. So line those raw edges up facing towards the number 2, and before you stitch it, just give a test and make sure that all of the fabric is covering. If not, we can make that a little adjustment and check again. So my raw edges are along that blue line, but I will be stitching a 1/4 inch. When that row of stitching is done, we have stitched right through that back batting and those front pieces. So we're quilting as we go along. And with these fabrics already pre-pressed, we can just finger press them. And that raw edge now matches the next blue line. We can now do number 3. We're going to need a piece 2.5 inches, and this time it's a little longer by 7 inches. I will be doing the same thing, matching up the edge of the fabric, and give a test and see if it covers. If not, we need to move this fabric down. Give another peek, and we're going to see that that's going to cover all of that area. And we could stitch right off of the end, stitch all the way until we come right off of that quilt batting. All of this extra is going to be trimmed off after. We can now finger press number 3 over. We're going to be able to continue doing 4 and then 5, just keep continuing until we get to the end. As we put down the side pieces, we will end up covering this long line. So I would recommend to just put it right over top of the fabric as you go along. It is just a placement line, so you can write right over top of that fabric and come right off of that end. So I won't need to mark all of them. I just have a marking at one side, and then I'll be sure to mark that other side. And you'll see how this line will help when we move on to these side angles. Once that one side is all stitched down, I need to do the next side. If you stop and start your fabric right along that line, you will not need to put that mark. But if you had your fabric a little bit bigger, you will need to draw that mark. So I can see the blue mark on the one end, and I know that's going to line up. So I now will be able to take that fabric and line it up against that drawn line and stitch a 1/4 inch. And this will go for both sides. If you stop and start right at that blue line, you do not need to draw that extra line. Those edges are now stitched in, but I still have that correct line. And by following that size, when I fold that over, I'm lined right up to that next blue line. And I can finish those corners. And all of those pieces are stitched down except that last piece. When we turn it over, all of the quilting has been done. Now I would recommend using matching thread, but you can see how all of that quilting is now done for us. I'm going to put a couple of drops of glue in that last corner, hand press that over, and just let that dry. And I'm going to do that to both corners. I just want that piece to stay down because I do want to stitch all the way around the original stitching that I did. By following that outside, I can now see where that bag shape is. And just the same as we did to this bottom, we're going to cut just on the outside of that line. And that's going to trim off all the extra batting and all of these loose ends. With this cutout, that front of the bag definitely looks a lot nicer. This curve is the handle, and that's the area we're going to have to put some binding. Now you can do a traditional method of binding just like you do with a quilt. We do not need binding on this bottom, just these 2 curves. And I will be using this pre-cut binding. And I'm going to glue it on first before I stitch it. When we look at this pre-made binding, we're going to see that one side is a little bit longer than the other side. The short side is the top, that little bit longer is the bottom. And that way, as we stitch along the one edge, we're sure to get that bottom. We will need 2 pieces to cover both edges. And I'm just going to pre-cut those first. When we look at this binding, It is folded in half, and that fold needs to run along this edge. So we can push that right up against the edge. Start in the center and go out. And this time I'm going to be able to use a little heat. Put a couple of drops of glue on that fabric, match up that fold, give a little press. Go on to the next edge. You could do a couple inches at a time and just have that edge go right against the fold. And you can really feel it right along this edge. And continue. Once that larger back side has been put on the back, we're going to be able to turn that over and put a little bit of glue underneath and reset it with the iron. That binding is going to come right off, and you can see that that bottom is a little bit bigger than the top. And that way, when you go to stitch along this edge, you're guaranteed to stitch that bottom. So stitch all the way around this edge, and that glue is just going to hold it all in place. And then repeat on the second side. If you used a little bit too much glue, some of the glue might come through. Well, it will wash out. You can also just take a wet cloth and rub it over top, and it's going to take that top bit of glue out. Take this and fold it so the right sides are matching, and sew those two long edges together. And this seam will only be 1/4 inch. From here we need to put that bottom on, but I do like to take those side seams and press them open. So you'll have to get some kind of a bar or a piece of wood or a pressing ham and open up those seams. And to get that seam to lay down flat as it's still hot, just put your hands over top of it until that seam cools down. And when it cools down, it's just going to stay open nicer. Now I can trim off these little pieces. We need to find the 4 equal sides to this bottom. We already have the 2 because they are the side seams. And just put a pin in each corner. Now we have our 4 parts. And those 4 parts will match our little marks on the bottom of that circle. We can now match up those quarters to our pins and our sides and pin that bottom on. This is one time I do like to use a lot of pins. If you're pinning it and you find that that bottom seems to be a little bit bigger than that outside, pull the fabric bottom to the sides so this bottom is a little bit flatter, and you're going to find that it's going to have less wrinkles around that area. Now we can sew it with all these pins, but I would recommend doing a basting stitch all the way around and then taking those pins out. This basting is definitely one extra step, but it is a lot easier when you get to the machine, and it does make a very nice bottom. I do want to stitch this on with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so I am using my 1/4 inch foot. I'll be working on a small portion at a time and stopping and moving. I can see and feel that everything's flat, and I'm not worried about all of this bulk. We can pull it right out of the way and stitch. Stop, just make sure it's all straightened up. You can put your hand inside the bag and make sure everything's smoothed out. And go around. And you'll be able to see when you need to stop and give it another straighten. And you can see where the pins would definitely be in my way. I'm just taking my time and going around. And once we've gone around once, we can back stitch just a little bit and take off our knots. And if you'd like, you can always take out that basting. We can see how smooth and flat the bottom of that bag is. If you'd like, you could do a little row of zigzag around that edge to finish it off. Now when we turn this right side out, we have that nice finished bottom of the bag. It's already quilted for us, That handle has a nice finish to it. And this is the edge where we held that seam down until it cooled down. And you can see how nice and flat it wants to stay. And the wine gift bag is now done. These do fit a bottle of wine quite nice, and they protect that bottle of wine as we're carrying it. But we can definitely add more than wine. If you know someone who likes to go to the gym, we can put in a water bottle and maybe a little towel. And this could be something that they could carry with them to the gym. Put their keys in there, hang this off the bike, or have it sitting beside them so that they have everything they need handy. If you have someone who loves to cook, you can always fill it with food. Put some wooden spoons in here, and it would make a nice gift just for someone who enjoys being in the kitchen. Of course, we could always give it to a friend that enjoys sewing and have some sewing supplies in here and a little piece of fabric wrapped up. And it's good for someone who knits or crochets. They could always put their wool inside here and have that wool stay there so that if they're working, the wool's just going to come right out and it's not rolling around. It kind of keeps it all organized, and it's a great way to travel while you're knitting or you're doing your crafts and hobbies. They might be designed for a bottle of wine, but I can think of a lot of different things that would fit inside and be a nice gift when you are going to someone's house. And if you can't visit someone, this is a great thing to hang on their door. And what a surprise they're going to get when they open up the door and have not only the nice bag that they can reuse, but something fun inside. If you're to make these bags, what would you put in them? Or what would you like to have given to you inside of the bags? I'll put a link in the description so you can check out that pattern. And thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe. And as always, come on back. Let's see what we're sewing next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.